Hello. In our last episode, pinag-usapan natin doon yung isang maikling kasaysayan ng intelligence testing. I mentioned in that video that in that episode, it is not meant to discuss everything that happened that led to the current state of intelligence tests. Kayo na lang bahala magbasa ng mga specific events or other details that you may be looking for in the development of modern day intelligence test. We are going to do the same thing for today's episode. This time pag-uusapan natin short history of personality tests. Just like what we did with intelligence tests, this is just a very summarized version of the history of personality testing. Pero bago natin pag-usapan yung history of personality testing, first let's understand what do we mean by personality. This is a very psychological term and I think all psych majors must master kung ano ba talaga ibig sabihin ng personality or ugali sa Tagalog. I mean, if you are a student of psychology, kinakailangan talaga maipaliwanag mo ng maayos sa ibang tao what exactly do we mean by personality or ugali. The key word for the word personality is consistent. A person's consistent way of thinking, feeling, or behaving in a given situation refers to a person's personality. Sa Tagalog, ng usual way is madalas. Paano ka madalas mag-isip? Ano yung mga madalas mong nararamdaman? Ano yung mga madalas mong ginagawa sa isang sitwasyon refers to your personality or ugali. Another word that I think can better enlighten you para maintindihan yung personality is pattern. Yung personality ng tao o ugali ng tao, ito yung kanyang pattern whenever this person is faced in a certain situation. Ano yung pattern ng pag-iisip niya, emotions niya, mga ginagawa niya kapag siya ay nasa isang sitwasyon, yun yung tinatawag nating personality. For example, heartbreak, kapag binasted ka ng nililigawan mo. Ano yung personality mo kapag ikaw ay nababasted? Ano yung madalas mong iniisip? Ano yung madalas mong ginagawa? Ano yung madalas mong nararamdaman? Whenever you are in that situation, yun yung ugali ng tao. Again, personality, big words here. Key words here are the words pattern, consistent way of thinking, feeling, and behaving. So yan yung sinusukat natin sa personality testing. We want to measure yung tinatawag nating personality of the psyche. We are trying to catch the pattern of the psyche that we want to measure. Okay? Oh, sabi nga ni Gandhi dito, no, just to further illustrate what personality is, keep your thoughts positive because your thoughts become your words. Keep your words positive because your words become your behavior. Keep your behavior positive because your behavior becomes your habits, and then that habits become your values, and that values become the outcome of your life. In the same way, ganun din ang personality ng tao, no? Mahalaga na pag-usapan natin yung personality because it will determine the outcome of our life. Whether we are going to be healthy or unhealthy, whether we become successful or not successful, it all depends on those patterns in our personality. So again, yan yung sinusubukan nating sukatin in personality testing. So let's now go to the history, the short history of personality testing. Paano ba ito nagsimula lahat? The following are some of the pictures that are very influential in the development of personality testing. The first picture that we are going to talk about is this one. This is a picture of what we call the mental asylum. Ano bang ibig sabihin ng mental asylum? Let's discuss. During the Industrial Revolution in the Western world, maraming mga mental health professionals observe na dumami yung mga tao na nagpapakita ng mga symptoms of mental illness. Dumami yung mga taong merong sakit sa pag-iisip, and that is very understandable given the current situation of people during the Industrial Revolution. Mataas yung level of stress, humina yung family systems, humina yung relationship ng mga magkakapamilya. So you add everything up, nagkaroon ng malaking numbers of people suffering from mental illness. Kasi yung mga tao, first time pa lang nilang maka-experience ng Industrial Revolution, so their minds were not ready for the demands. Ang ending, marami sa kanila nag-develop ng mental illness symptoms. And during those times, whenever a person is mentally ill, nilalagay sila sa mental asylums. During those times, mental asylums are not good places to be. In fact, isa ito sa mga pinakapangit na places, pinaka-iniiwasan na lugar ng mga tao na malagay sila because there is a very poor condition of mental asylums during those times. Hindi masyadong binabudgetan ng government, and to be put in a mental asylum will give you stigma. Talagang maaalala ka ng mga tao because you were inside a mental asylum. Now, during those times, if you compare mental asylums to our modern day mental institutions today, napakalayo ng mga treatments that are being applied. For example, during those times, the following are the usual treatments being done to people in mental asylums. Nangunguna dyan, exorcism. So during those times, if you are mentally ill at nilagay ka sa asylum, ikaw ay i-exorcise. Palalayasin yung bad spirit or evil spirit within you, assuming or hoping that when that happens, your mental condition will improve. Question, saan ba nanggaling yan? Bakit ba during those times, paniniwala, mental illness equals to demon possession because of what the church has taught about mental illness? During those times kasi, very dominant yung idea that mental illness is caused by evil spirits inside a person's mind or inside the person's brain. And meron itong mga biblical basis, no? For example, in Luke 11:14, Jesus was driving out a demon that was mute. When the demon left, the man who had been mute spoke and the crowd was amazed. This is a very simple model of mental illness based on Luke 11:14. Merong sakit yung mama dito, hindi siya makapagsalita. So in a way, may pagka-psychological disorder yan, 'di ba? Yung you are mute to a certain extent. But what happened? Paano gumaling yung tao na sa Luke 11:14? He was exorcised by Jesus. So when the evil spirit left that guy, anong nangyari? The man began to speak. Nakapagsalita siya, gumaling siya sa kanyang linguistic condition. So this is one of the models that gave power to the idea that mental illness during those times are caused by evil spirits. Nandyan din yung physical torture. Related din yan sa demon possession model of the mind, no? Kaya tinotorture yung mga tao sa mental asylums hoping that the evil spirit inside the person's body will be disturbed, mababad trip, therefore aalis siya sa katawan ng tao to escape the pain brought by the physical torture. Yun yung logic bakit sila tinotorture during those times. But one of the most controversial treatments during those time, yung tinatawag nating trepanation, where people inside mental asylums, binubutasan yung kanilang ulo. No? Somewhere here in our skull, binubutasan yan, hoping that when that happens, kapag may butas na yung skull nung taong may mental illness, the evil spirit inside the person's brain will come out, leading to improvement in psychological condition. Ang tanong, saan naman nanggaling yung ganyang practice? Because during those times, merong sikat na paniniwala, a very popular belief that evil spirits are residing inside a person's brain, specifically the brain. So kapag ikaw nag-undergo ka ng trepanation, binutasan yung skull mo, and that evil spirit comes out of that hole in your skull, then you become better. Nanggaling yan sa katuruan ng mga philosophers na ang evil spirit nakatira sa tinatawag nating pineal gland of the brain. Pineal gland of the brain is somewhere within that part, kaya yan yung part ng skull na binubutasan kasi malapit yan yung pineal gland. So when that evil spirit finds an opening in the skull, assumption is that evil spirit will leave the person's brain, leading to improvement in the person's psychological health. So, yun ang mga usual treatments of people na merong mental illness inside the mental asylum. Very far away from the way we treat people today inside mental institutions. In fact, lahat ng sinabi ko ngayon na treatment, these are no longer being done in modern day mental institutions. Lahat ng sinabi ko ngayon dito are already considered obsolete or outdated or even inhumane way of treating mental illness. But during those times, when they deal with mental illness, one of the most controversial issue is paano nila nalalaman if a person is mentally ill. How can we know what are the indicators, what are the evidences or the basis in saying that a person is mentally ill? Ang sagot, wala. The main problem during those times is wala silang objective way, wala silang objective standard of determining whether a person is mentally ill or not. Yung mga criteria nila noon is only based on simple observation. If the person looks crazy, if a person looks mentally ill, then probably he or she is. Or kung medyo minalas-malas ka pa, pwede kang mabansagang mentally ill kapag pinagchismisan ka ng mga kapitbahay mo. And that is not a good thing because usually ginagawang way ito to get rid of a person in the community. Let's say meron tayong kapitbahay, ayaw natin lahat sa kanya, let's call him Pedro. Ang gagawin natin, ipapakalat natin yung balita na si Pedro is mentally ill. Eventually, the government will hear about this and they will send people to get Pedro out of the community and place him in mental asylums. So, ganun yung basihan nila noon in diagnosing someone na merong mental illness based on observation and pure hearsay. This is not a good practice na nakita ni Emil Kraepelin. That's why sabi niya, hindi pwedeng magpatuloy yung ganitong practice. We need to have an objective standard of mental illness. Kinakailangan meron tayong matibay na basihan for us to say that someone is really mentally ill. So, ang ginawa niya, because he is a student of the psychoanalytic school of understanding personality, as we know, pag sinabi mong psychoanalytic, you look at a person's unconscious. So, Emil Kraepelin believes that if we really want to know if a person is mentally ill or mentally healthy, we need to measure the person's unconscious level. Titignan natin kung meron ba siyang mga patterns in the unconscious that will prove, that will show whether a person is mentally ill or not. And as we know, di ba sa psychoanalytic movement, the levels of the mind, the unconscious is the deepest layer of the human mind. We have the conscious, subconscious, and the unconscious. The question is, how do we know, how do we measure the contents of a person's unconscious? Kaya tayo gumagamit ng projective test. In projective tests, these are tests that are designed for us to get to know or to have an idea how healthy a person's unconscious is. So one of the forms of projective test is the umbrella term. Maraming klaseng projective test. But one of the first, isa sa mga pinakanaunang na develop na projective test is called the free association test. And most psych majors would understand how the free association test would work. Diba? Sa free association test, you will be the patient will be given random words and the instruction is, tell me any word that first comes into your mind after you hear the stimulus word. Diba? Sasabihan ka na huwag ka nang mag-isip. Basta kung ano yung unang word or idea or picture that you saw in your mind after you hear that word, yun yung sasabihin mo, no? That's how free association test works. Let's do that right now. For example, I show you the word celebrate. Again, what comes to your mind? What picture did you see in your mind? Sinful, sex, dog, handsome, homosexual, beautiful. So, as a psychoanalyst, ang gagawin ko, I am going to collect all the words, list down all the words you mentioned after you hear these words, and then in the end of the process, as a psychoanalyst, I am going to interpret kung ano yung mga words na sinabi mo. So based on the words that you responded, that you said, after you hear these words, gagawan ko yan ng clinical interpretation. Now, clinical interpretation involves a lot of training. Kaya hindi lahat pwedeng mag-handle ng projective test. You need hard training for you to effectively or to accurately predict the meanings of the responses of a person na kumuha ng free association test. In most masteral programs, especially for example in De La Salle University, Manila, pinag-aaralan talaga yan ng isang term. Meron kayong subject dyan called projective techniques. One of the things na pinag-uusapan sa projective techniques is how do you interpret responses coming from clients who have taken free association test. Meron yung mga dynamics, meron yung mga principles na sinusunod for you to accurately interpret projective tests. Now, later on, after the free association test, marami ng ibang mga projective test na na-develop. Nandiyan na yung thematic apperception test, also known as a TAT. Ang ginagawa dito is the client is asked to interpret what he or she sees on this picture. 'Di ba? So, papakwentuhin ka dito, no? Ano sa tingin mo yung nangyayari sa picture na yan? And then the psychoanalyst again records the narrative that the person or the client is saying, and then in the end of the process, i-interpret na naman yan ng psychoanalyst. And of course, we also have the very popular Rorschach ink blot test, the magic question, tell me what do you see? And again, regardless if you are taking TAT or Rorschach, it involves a lot of clinical skills para ma-interpret mo ng maayos kung ano ang sinasabi ng mga test na ito about your client's unconscious. From there, malalaman natin if a person is mentally ill or not. Yun yung sinasabi ni Emil Kraepelin na dapat natin gawing system in diagnosing whether a person is mentally ill or mentally healthy. Now, fast forward, nung na-develop na yung mga projective tests na ito, many psychologists, especially in the field of psychometrics, saw a very big problem in the approach of projective tests. Napaka-subjective ng mga projective tests. Ibig sabihin, in psychometric terms, mababa ang reliability. Because the way we interpret projective tests is based on what the clinician thinks or based on what the clinician says, there is always a tendency na yung mga sinasabi ng clinician baka bias. Baka hindi naman talaga yon yung correct interpretation about the person's or about the client's personality, but because of the clinician's bias, nadi-distort yung tunay na kalagayan ng personality ng tao. So again, in psychometric terms, mababa ang reliability ng mga projective tests. Let me give you a very practical example. Halimbawa, gumamit tayo ng draw a person test. Kumuha tayo ng isang bata, nagpa-drawing tayo sa kanila as the instruction of draw a person test, and then punta tayo sa psychometrician A, B, and C. Tatlong magkakaibang psychometricians. And then we let them interpret the drawing of the child. According to many studies, tendency is these three psychometricians will have three different interpretations of this drawing. Iba ang sasabihin ni psychometrician A, iba na naman yung sasabihin ni B, iba na naman yung sasabihin ni C about what is the psychological condition of this child. And this is not good in the field of psychometrics because we are expected to be objective, to be exact. Hindi pwedeng bias yung mga sinasabi ng mga psychometricians about a single drawing. Pero wala ganun talaga yung nature ng projective test, no? Very prone to the bias of the clinician. That is why, gumawa ng paraan yung ibang mga psychometrician, sabi nila, bakit hindi natin gayahin yung approach ng IQ testing where we are quantifying or we are reducing intelligence into single scores. Remember, yan yung unit of measure ng IQ. Gaano katalino yung tao, you reduce that into a number, that is the person's IQ. And during those times, in the early history of personality testing, ongoing at malakas na, well-established na yung IQ testing. It has already become very popular. So many psychometricians thought, why don't we simulate, or sorry, why don't we imitate the approach of IQ testing? If they can quantify intelligence to a single score, why don't we do the same with personality? Gawin din nating score yung ugali o yung mga traits ng tao. So yun yung kanilang recommendation. Let's adapt the scorable IQ system coming from intelligence test to personality test. Ang ginagawa, 'di ba, sa IQ ang ginagawa diyan is we get the raw score of the person, we compare it to a norm, and from there doon manggagaling yung interpretation natin ng score nung kliyente. Ganon din ang gawin natin sa personality. Let them take a test, reduce their performance in that test through a score, a raw score, and then that raw score will be compared to a norm, and then from there, yung norm ang magi-interpret kung ano yung ugali ng tao. So if we are going to do that right now, for example, ganito ang magiging approach natin, you will be given items to answer in relation to your personality. So depende gaano katotoo yung bawat statement na ito sa'yo, sasagutan mo yan ng numbers 1 to 5, also known as the Likert format. And then at the end of the process, isusulat ko as the psychometrician, i-record ko yung mga scores mo, yung mga responses mo na binigay mo for each item, and then from there, I am going to get the raw score of these personality items, compare it to a norm, and then from there, malalaman ko kung ano ang iyong tunay na ugali. Now, that is a very simple way of quantifying personality, but statistical analysis later on evolved. Marami ng mga statistical methods ang naimbento na naging sophisticated. Dati-rati, correlation lang, hanggang sa nag-evolve yan, nagfa-factor analysis na yung mga statistician. And that factor analysis, just to give you a gist, factor analysis is a statistical process where we are looking for patterns in the way test takers answered a certain test. So yung mga different scores nila, mga different responses nila for each item, hinahanapan ng factor analysis ng mga patterns, hinahanapan ng factor analysis ng mga quote-unquote loadings, kung ano yung mga items na nagkukumpul-kumpulan, ano yung mga items na related sa isa't isa. That process of analyzing scores coming from personality test led to the development of the most popular personality test that we know today. Dahil sa factor analysis, for example, nagkaroon na tayo ng standardized personality test tulad ng MMPI, 16PF, and the very popular Neo-PyR. Lahat ito ay naging produkto ng factor analysis. Bibigyan natin ng items yung mga tao, asking them about their personality, and then they are going to answer that using the Likert system. Each item, depending on how true is that item for them, they encircle the number, and then we do factor analysis, and then from that, nakaka-discover tayo ng mga big traits o ng mga super traits that consist of a person's personality. So, nandyan na nga, tulad nga na sinabi ko kanina, MMPI, 16PF, Neo-PyR, but one of the most popular personality test na ginagamit ngayon would be the Big 5 personality test. Obviously, based on the name, according to the test, lahat daw ng tao, yung personality natin, ay merong 5 components. Easily remembered as ocean, openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Again, this is the result of factor analyzing responses of people who answered certain personality test. So, based on factor analysis ng maraming mga tao, ang kaugalian ng mga tao, merong 5 components, yun na yung Big 5 personality test. Okay? So, yan yung approach ng Big 5 personality test. We try to quantify how high or how low a person's ocean is. Openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And one more thing that is very important about the Big 5 personality test, kaya ito ay isa sa mga pinakasikat na test, it is universal. If you study the literature of the Big 5 personality model, you will discover na yung 5 na yon, yung ocean na yon, makikita sa iba't ibang mga kultura. Kahit saang kultura ka raw pumunta, there will always be an expression of openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. At yan ang nagpapaliwanag kung bakit yung Big Five personality test is universally used. Ito yung isa sa mga pinaka-common na ginagamit in personality measurement kasi nga dahil sa kaniyang claim of universality. Now, after the development of projective test, in fairness, mukhang dumami yung mga psychometricians na mas nagtiwala sa standardized personality test. And I think it makes sense because the advantage of standardized personality test is it's very objective. Hindi na tayo magkakaroon ng tatlong magkakaibang interpretation coming from three different psychometricians because personality is now reduced to numbers that are being compared to a norm. We will only have one interpretation of this person's personality. Hindi na nakabase sa opinion, nakabase na siya sa computation, nakabase na siya sa quantitative formula na ginagamit natin to label or to interpret a person's personality. So mas naging objective, mas naging eksakto yung pagbasa natin sa ugali ng tao using the standardized personality test. Pero hindi rin ito perpekto. There are also weaknesses of the standardized personality test tulad ng dalawang ito. Number one, it's very prone to social desirability. Ibig sabihin, pwedeng loko-lokohin lang ng tao yung kanyang personality. The person or the test taker may answer the personality test in a way that he or she thinks is positive for the psychometrician. Halimbawa, meron ditong item, I watch porn every day. Siyempre, in our culture, hindi maganda na ugali yung nanonood ka ng porn. So, in that item, for example, dahil gusto mo look good ka, gusto mo desirable ka, ayaw mong magmukhang maniac in that item, kahit ang sagot mo talaga ay 5, ganun talaga yung trait mo, 5 ka, nood ka ng porn, no? Because of social desirability, you may end up answering that item as a 1 or a 2. Diba? So, doon pa lang napeke mo na. Hindi mo sinagot yung talagang ugali mo. Instead of 5, you encircle 2. Very common problem in standardized personality test. Number 2 is faking and guessing. And I know, for those of you who have experiences in standardized personality test, you understand how easy it is to fake the responses of these kinds of tests. Bilog-bilugan mo lang yan randomly, pwede ka na magkaroon ng personality test score And very common ito, for example, sa mga high school students. Diba? Yung kapag sumasagot sila ng mga mahabang personality test, gusto na nilang umuwi, wala sila sa mood. So what do? They just randomly encircle the Likert items. And in the end, hindi naman magmamatter yun. In the end, kahit ano pang bilog-bilog mo dyan, meron ka pa ring score na makukuha. So you can only imagine yung final score na makukuha natin na niloko-loko lang ng isang test taker, yun ang paniniwalaan nating totoo. So we have no power, we cannot really be so sure kung sineryoso ba talaga nung test taker yung personality test na kinuha niya. So I think yan yung common na issue between numbers 1 and 2. We cannot be so sure if the test taker is accurately answering the standardized personality test. Kaya para solusyonan ito, may ibang mga psychometricians, ito ang naging solusyon nila, no? Huwag kasi nating ilagay sa kamay ng ating mga kliyente yung kanilang personality because again, they may paint themselves in the way that is not them. Pwede nila tayong iligaw. Pwede nila tayong lokohin. Pwede nilang i-paint yung sarili nila to be the person who are not them. Hindi talaga sila ganon. Yun lang yung gusto nilang maging. You see, that's the problem with standardized personality test. So, ang sabi ng ibang mga psychometricians, tayo dapat ang magde-determine kung ano ang personality ng ating kliyente. So, from the client, ilalagay natin yung assessment process o yung measurement process to the psychometrician him or herself. Kaya na-imbento yung laboratory-based personality test wherein we do direct observation of the person's personality. Kaya dito na nauso yung mga laboratory na merong one-way mirror, 'di ba? Usually, you enter the laboratory, tapos meron diyang one-way mirror, and then merong isang room doon sa kabilang side of the laboratory wherein yun yung oobserbahan ng isang psychometrician. And this is where the use of checklist started. Because you are observing patterns of thinking, feeling, and behavior in the other side of the room, while you are observing your client, meron kang hawak na checklist, doon mo nilalagay yung mga scores ng kanyang personality. One good example of that would be the child behavior checklist. In child behavior checklist or CBCL, ino-observe natin dito yung overall behavior ng isang bata from ages 2 to 3 years old. So what we do here is we get that child into a laboratory, we put the child in a room, okay? That child may play with another psychometrician or with other kids, and while the child is acting normally in the room, doon sa kabilang room, the psychometrician, hawak-hawak itong checklist na ito, and then encircling the appropriate numbers that he or she sees in connection to how the child is behaving in the other room. Tapos ang ending niyan, edi tapos mo ng bilugan na lahat, ito total yung mga scores dyan, and then makakuha ka na naman ng raw score, and that raw score will be compared to the norm, and the norm will determine what is the meaning of what you observed from the child. Ginagamit din itong approach na ito, for example, in diagnosing certain psychological conditions tulad ng autism. Halimbawa, meron kang kliyente, nagdududa yung eskwelahan kung meron bang autism yung batang ito. What you do is you put that child in another room, okay, in the laboratory, and then there's a room in the laboratory, and then as a psychometrician, oobserbahan mo yung behavior ng bata while the child is interacting with another psychometrician or with other children. And again, you are going to score the person's behavior based on what you are seeing in your observation inside the laboratory. This time, ang hawak mo naman yung tinatawag nating autism behavior checklist. The logic is the same. As you observe this child interact with the adult, as you observe this child interact with other kids, checkan mo, bibilugan mo, i-scorean mo yung mga bawat items na yan based on what you see on the behavior of the child that you are observing. So yun yung three big waves of measuring personality. It started with projective, and then it led to standardized personality test, and then it led to laboratory-based observation of personality. Now, before we end this lecture video, again, let me repeat, this video is not meant to be a very exhaustive lesson on the history of personality test. Let me tell you, marami pang nangyari in the history of personality test na hindi na natin nasabi dito, no? These are just some of the highlights of what took place in the development of personality testing. If you want to know more about how personality tests develop in history, you want to know the dates, you want to know the people, you can just read chapters from psychometrics textbooks that talk about the history of personality test. But I just want to close this video by sharing with you lessons that we can learn based on this short discussion of the history of personality testing. Number one, I hope you realize that personality is something important to assess, just like IQ. Ang IQ, ginagamit natin yan, yung intelligence test, ginagamit natin yan to help us decide about our clients na may kinalaman sa mga intellectual issues, di ba? Dito sa personality testing, ganun din naman. Remember, personality is about thinking, feeling, and behaving. We want to measure those three. And why do we want to measure those three? Well, one of the obvious reasons is for mental health purposes. We want to know kung sino ba yung mga taong poor ang mental health, sino yung mga okay ang mental health, who needs help because they have poor mental health before we can we know, we need to make sure na yung mga bibigyan nating tulong, bibigyan natin ng intervention, mga kailangan talaga ng tulong. 'Di ba? And how do we know who are these people with poor mental health? We give them personality tests. But again, let me just emphasize this. Personality test is not only being used in the clinical context, you can also use personality test in other contexts tulad ng eskwelahan, tulad ng industrial setting, for example, or even in the field of sports. Kapag alam natin yung ugali ng mga tao in different contexts, it can help us make good decisions, accurate decisions about those people. Again, tulad nga doon sa mental health, sino ang bibigyan mo ng intervention, sino ang hindi kailangan ng intervention sa konteksto ng trabaho. O, bagay ba yung kliyenteng ito o bagay ba yung aplikanteng ito sa trabaho na ina-applyan niya? To answer that question, you need results coming from personality tests. So again, personality testing, there are many potential uses of this kind of test. And number two, there are different ways to measure personality. And we saw that from our short discussion. Nagsimula tayo sa projective, naging standardized personality test, and then naging laboratory-based, no? Depende yan kung ano yung gagamitin mo na way, depende yan sa iyong personal orientation as a psychologist. Are you a psychologist who believes in the psychoanalytic movement? Or are you a psychologist who believe in the standardized personality testing movement? Or do you believe in what behaviorists are doing na oobserbahan yung mga external behaviors to understand personality better? Again, it all depends on your orientation. But ako personally, no, I think hindi tayo dapat exclusively nagiging fan ng isang approach lang. Hindi pwedeng sabihin mo na sa lahat ng sitwasyon psychoanalytic ka lang or standardized ka lang or observation method ka lang. We have to be eclectic in our approach. The kind of personality test that we will use must depend on, again, number one, the context of the assessment, and number two, the background of the client. Hindi yung lahat ng sitwasyon, ito lang yung pipiliin nating approach. Again, ang tawag dito, we need to be eclectic. Because remember, each of the traditions, each of the ways of understanding personality, merong strengths and weaknesses. Lahat may weaknesses. And so, if lahat may weaknesses, we cannot say that a certain way of assessing personality will work at all times in all situations. So, we need to be eclectic on this. Kaya nga, ang isang psychometrician na magaling, dapat meron siyang skill set. Magaling siya sa mga skill set ng iba't ibang mga ways on measuring personality. Magaling siya sa psychoanalytic way. Magaling siya sa standardized way. Magaling din siya sa observation/behavioral ways. So that is one of the things or one of the qualities of a good psychometrician, which I think is very important to develop. So that ends our short discussion on the history of personality tests. If you have any questions about our lecture for today, don't hesitate to just post a question in the comment section, and I'm going to do my best to answer those questions. Thank you everyone for listening. Until next time, God bless.